Yeah, my daughter today, for Rashi, my daughter asked me for a Dvar Torah about science and the Torah. I said, well, that's this pasuk. It says everybody saw the sounds. The and the flames, and how can you see the sounds? Science says you can't see sounds. So for 2,000 years, people looked at this pasuk and they were laughing. But now we know that you could easily see the sound. You could see like the decibels on the on your or the decibel meter. So you could easily see the sounds.
Apple Watch.
On your Apple Watch, yeah. Yeah, you could always see it. Now everybody sees that when the Torah says something, of course it comes true. Everybody saw the sound of the shofar. They saw the smoky mountains. And the people saw and they were moved. And they stood far away. What's the pasuk? Let's go. There was nobody there who was blind. What does it mean there was nobody there who was blind? What do you think that means before we go on? What do you think there was nobody there who was blind? What do you think that means, Ezra? What do you think that means?
Everybody saw it?
Yeah, but think deeper. What do you think? To me, it means everybody had clarity when they stood at Sinai. Everybody had vision. So much of our problems in this world is because we have no vision, meaning we don't see the big picture. We don't see the little picture or the big picture. We don't see any picture.
Rabbi Nachman has a beautiful story called the seven bletlach, the seven beggars. And so it's 7 people who show up and they show up to a wedding of an orphan and an orphanate, and they basically say, the blind one says, I see things that nobody else sees, and the deaf person says, I hear things that nobody else does. So yeah, it's the same what you just said about the power of sight and of hearing is a lot more than what we just physically feel or think.
That's what I think it means. At Sinai, nobody was lacking vision, and everybody could hear each other. There was nobody who was a mute, meaning everybody had the majesty of knowing exactly the right word to say. So many times we say the wrong thing. Verse states, there was nobody who was deaf. How often are we deaf to what we need to hear? Yeah, Moshe.
So you're saying everything was clear, like the communication and everything.
Exactly, Moshe. Exactly.
No problems.
There was, and it was even deeper than that. It was,
Everybody's eyes were open.
People were hearing what they were supposed to hear and saying what they were supposed to say, and that was the true miracle at Sinai. Was not that they could see the sounds, but that there was an awareness.
And
Benjamin.
This pasuk just has such a musical quality, right? It says, they heard they saw the shofar and they saw Tahar Ashan. Usually, smoke. You can't see when there's smoke, but Dafka they saw the smoke.
Beautiful.
And they saw Merachok. Right, they saw from a distance.
Yeah.
Right, so even from a distance, they could see.
Yeah,
it's really poetic.
Even the people who were standing far away, who had been at a spiritual distance, were now close
through the smoke.
Beautiful. Yeah, Jeff, I cut you off.
Since God has no tongue and mouth and no lungs, when you hear, you obviously can't hear the way normal people communicate. So it was an extra. Not territorial, extra world communication.
Well, that's what we're saying here is exactly that. What we're saying here is that if we read this on a deeper level, we're saying that means everybody had the clarity of vision and of how to communicate, as Moshe said. Exactly right. Yeah, Reb Ezra
said they weren't as distracted back then. There's more
very nice. Well, there was yes and no. I agree with you, but also it's the case that to each generation has their own distractions, but the point was that there were people who weren't as focused, and there's also different degrees of focus. They weren't as dialed in until they stood at Sinai. Yeah, that's what they were dialed in at Sinai. Exactly right. Rashi says, they were seeing that which is audible. They saw that which is impossible to see elsewhere. And also we can read this on a deeper level, Reb Seth. We're on chapter 20, verse 15. So they were seeing that which they had never understood, were able to see before. And Reb Jeff here said, oh, you can't at Sinai, you can't, Jeff was saying, our teacher, Reb Jeff was saying, it's impossible to see God. Of course it is impossible. It's impossible for God to speak. This is word. Yeah, but that's true. But still here at this moment, they had ability to see with greater clarity than they've ever seen before, when an understanding of God. As the sounds that came out from God. They had can you imagine if we stood at Sinai, can you imagine the clarity of vision, of purpose, of insight into God? Speaking of that, it's interesting that all the 10 Commandments, Rabbi Soloveitchik made this point, none of them are really ritualistic. They're all interpersonal ethical commandments. That's what Rabbi, once we get beyond the first three, which are different, but they're all interpersonal ethical commandments. Even the Shabbos is don't abuse your workers, give your workers, everybody who is even your animals, a day off. That's an interesting point that Rabbi Soloveitchik made today, which I saw today. Okay, and the Vayanu, when they moved, Einoel Azia means they trembled. Vayamdu merachok, and they stood far away. Rashi says, they jumped backwards 12 mil. How much is a mil? 3/4 of a mile. So that's they ran back 9 miles. That basically be like from here to Gaithersburg, I think, right? They ran back. Well, if you say that there are 600,000 people in the camp, there are 600,000 men, so that makes sense. It's around that many people from here to Gaithersburg. And that was the size of the camp. So the camp was 9 miles long. And then they jumped, they walked, they all moved, but the camp moved backwards. But the angels came and put them back, as it says, the kings of the legions move about. Yidodun. Kings of the legions move about. Okay. Vayomer al Moshe, verse 16. And they spoke to Moses. They said, Daber ata imanu v'nishma. You speak with us, and we will hear. V'ai daber imanu elokim penamos. They said, Moses, you speak to us, and we'll hear. Don't let God speak to us, we'll die. Rashi says, nothing on this pasuk. Vayomer Moshe al. Moshe says to the people, Al tirau, don't be afraid. Ki va'avur nasos eslem. Ba Elokim ubavor tia yiraso al pnechem levilti tachatam. Because in order to test you, God has come, and in order for his fear to be upon you and on your faces, so that you do not sin. Let's see what that means. Rashi says, I read it wrong. I read it in order to test you. That's not how Rashi reads it. Rashi reads it as l'gadel etchem ba'olam. God has come, brought you here not to test you, but to exalt you. Sheyetze lachem shem be'umos. That your name will be known amongst the nations. Shehu b'chvodo nigla lechem. And he revealed himself to you. Nasot means, Rashi says, lashon haramau gdula, an expression of elevation. Is that how Rabbi Steindl translates it? Verse 17, in order to exalt you.
No, he
does like
your translation, like to test.
Yeah, but that's not what Rashi says. Rashi says he's trying to raise you up. Arim nisi, I will raise up my banner. Interesting. Does he have a comment on that? Other commentaries understand nasos to test. That's how Ramban.
But he does say that the term for test can mean a banner.
It can be both. It's an unusual word because what's the test here? Rashi's explanation makes more sense in the context of the verse, but Ramban's, which is, or the other commentaries to test, which is Ibn Ezra, is the usual translation of nisayon, test. Vayamoda and the people stood. Oh, excuse me. And so that Rashi says, Bavortia yirato, ayidei sharitim otam yiraoim liyam. Through your seeing him as fearsome and awesome, Teidu ki ein zu ato, you shall know that there's none other than he, v'tira'u mipanav, and you'll be afraid of him. Verse 18. Vayamod ha'am merachok, and the people stood far away. Moshe nigash el Arafel. Moshe approached Arafel. What's Arafel? Fog. Asher Sham Elokim, where God is there. What does it mean Moshe approached the fog? Rashi says, Lifnim mi shalosh mechitzot. Inside 3 partitions. Choshech anan v'arafel. Darkness, cloud, and fog. As it says, V'ahar bo'er ba'esh, Alev ha'shamayim choshech anan v'arafel. So the arafel is the thick cloud. Shamaro hinei anochi ba'alecha ba'av v'anan. So there are 3 clouds surrounding God. So basically, Jeff, to answer your question, because I know you study Moreh Nevuchim, and the Rambam says it's all, how can you acknowledge, how could you see God have an image? God was shrouded here in the cloud. All Moshe was able to approach the cloud, the darkness, the cloud, the fog. You weren't able, it wasn't possible to see God because there was the cloud surrounding him. Even Moshe couldn't see God. All he could see was the back of God. There will never be another human being with as great insight into God as Moshe. The Torah tells us that. There's never going to be a human being as great as Moshe with knowledge of God.
Because we would drop dead just from the fear, right? Like he had such a close relationship that it doesn't matter what he saw, he would say, great, also he was always awake. All the other Nevi'im were asleep, according to the Rambam.
Yeah, exactly. Vayomer Hashem Moshe. Now Hashem said to Moshe, Ko tomorrow b'nei Yisrael, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, Atem re'isem ki min hashamayim dibarti machem. Now you have seen that I spoke to you from the heaven. I spoke with you from the heaven. Verse 19. Ko tomar, b'lashon hazeh. This is how you shall say. Atem re'item. You have seen. This is very beautiful Rashi. Yesh hefresh. There's a big difference between what a person sees and between what others people tell him. What others tell him, sometimes he doesn't believe. You only believe what you see. By the way, that used to be the case. Now you can't even believe what you see because they have AI manipulating the data.
Well, believe what you see in person, guys.
Even that, it's not too long before AI creates fake
People like you're ready.
Yeah, well, whatever. I'm just saying it used to be the case. It's not as simple as it states. Because from the heavens I spoke to you. And then another verse says, God came down to Mount Sinai. So there's a third verse that comes and distinguishes. From the heavens, he made his voice heard to you to rebuke you. And on the earth, he showed you his great fire. His glory was in heaven, and his fire and his strength was on earth. Alternatively, he bent the heavens and the heavens of the heavens, and spread them over the mountain. That's an interesting metaphor. He bent the heavens and spread them over the mountain. That's an interesting metaphor. Talk about poetry, Binyamin.
That is. It's elaborate right there, Rabbi.
It's a what?
It's elaborate. It's very abstract.
Beautiful. Okay, verse 20. Don't make for me, Elohei Kesef, Elohei Zahav. Do not make images with me of basically of gods of silver or gold. What does this mean? Rashi says, Wotasun demut shamashai. Don't make images of me, of those that serve me in heaven. Meaning to say, according to this, you shouldn't make images, the moon, the stars, the sun. And I think Seth probably can be much more informative on this, but I think Chabad is very strict about this, right? Did you ever notice that?
Yes, they don't draw the sun on they try to avoid that in the picture and things like that.
What about like a photograph of the sun? Will they put that?
I don't know, but it's true.
They're very strict about this, and they have what to base it on. Most people ever don't agree with that. Most people say it means like a 3D image. Because the flat image is clearly not the sun. It's just a drawing. But like Kasef, gods of silver. Boaz here all kruvim shata osel amorite. It's warning you about the kruvim that you make to stand with me. The kruvim were in the temple. Shaloyu shal kasef. You can't make them out of silver. Shem shinisem. So it's the kruvim or the faces with the wings. Now you need to make them out of gold. Let's say you want to make them out of silver. That if you make them out of silver, that's like idolatry. I mean, say the whole concept of making the kruvim is strange. We just said you can't have an image, and here we are taking an image and putting it in the temple. So it has to be exact. It has to be made out of gold and not silver. Other items in the temple, if there's no gold, you can use silver, but not the kruvim. That's what the Midrash is telling us. You're not allowed to make more than 2 kruvim. Shema sita arba. That if you make 4 kruvim, then it's like a false god. Here also, you're allowed to make more than 1 menorah. For example, you can have in the temple and that they had many menorahs in the courtyard of the temple. You're allowed to make more than 1 altar. You could have backup altars for when you need to replace the first altar. But you're only allowed 1 set of kruvim to make, because otherwise it's idolatry. Okay, now we have Lo tasu lachem, Lo tamar hareini oseh kruvim v'bate knesses bate midrashos. You can't say, you know what, I love the kruvim so much, I want to make it upstairs in Yeshiva Selling Melech. Now how to do that? It's a prohibition. You can't do it. You can't say I'm going to do it just like I did in the Beis HaMikdash. L'kach ne'amar lo tasu lachem. Okay, now we have something unusual. This is the first time we're being commanded to make something for the temple. Mizbeach adama tasela. You should make an altar of earth for me. V'zavachta alav et orotecha v'et shlomecha v'et soncha v'et bekarecha b'kol makom asher yazkir et shemi avo elecha u'veirachticha. You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall slaughter upon it your offerings, your olos, your shlomim, your sheep, your cattle. With every place that I mention my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. So this refers to the altar that's outside in the courtyard of the temple, sometimes called the altar of earth, sometimes called the copper altar, sometimes called the sacrificial altar. That's the altar that the animals go on. The altar inside the temple was the gold altar, and that was the altar which they placed the incense on every day. And then there were some sacrifices where the blood was placed on it. Just a few where the blood was placed on the inner altar. Mizbeach Adama, why is it called the altar of earth? Mechubar ba'adama, because this altar was connected to the earth. Shelo yivnu al gabi amudim al gabi basis. It wasn't built on pillars or a base like the copper altar, but rather it was built directly on the ground, or alternatively, Rashi says another reason why it's called the altar of earth, that they would take the inside of it and they would fill the hollow, because it was a hollow ramp, and underneath it they would fill that when they camped with earth when they were camped. How would they get it underneath? I guess they would place it there and then put it on top. Ta'aseli, you shall make for me. From the outset, you should construct it for me. It needs to be made for the purpose of my name. Okay. V'zavachta alav, you shall slaughter on it. You don't actually slaughter on the altar. Etzla, you slaughter next to it. The sacrifices were not slaughtered on the altar, they were slaughtered next to it.
What do you mean next, like on top of it?
Yeah, no, they didn't, they never slaughtered the animals on the altar. There were hooks there, places where they slaughtered the altar. If you ever see like in images, they put the animal's head through like a hook on the bottom, and that's where they slaughtered it. But they never slaughtered the animals on the altar. Then they carried the limbs to the altar and they sprinkled the blood on the corners of the altar, depending on which sacrificial offering it was. Your olos and your shlamim, asher mitzoncha mi b'karecha, which are from your flocks and your cattle. As tzonchaves b'karecha, your flock and your cattle. These are your oil offerings and your peace offerings. B'kol hamakom asher askirat shemi, wherever I mention my name, wherever I give you permission, asher etein lecha reshut la'askirat shem ha'meforshali, wherever I give you permission to mention my explicit name. What's the explicit name? So the Kohanim would sometimes use the 4-letter name, others would use the 12, others would use the 42-letter name. Different Kohanim had different practices to use. That's what the Gemara Kedushin says. And the Kohanim passed down secretly each generation, and they knew how to do it. Now probably there's only 1 or 2 Kohanim in the world who know it, and they're not telling us. But those
Jeff, we'll talk.
So wherever my name is mentioned, that's meaning to say, there I shall come and bless you. Mikana made you can only use this explicit name of God in the place where the divine person comes. Now, in the Beis HaMikdash, that was the only place where you could use the actual real name of God, not just the nicknames of God. There you can mention his actual name. And when do you do this? When you give the priestly blessing. So some Kohanim, they knew how to do this. And when they gave the priestly blessing, they would use the real name of God. And that's why on Yom Kippur, you remember on Yom Kippur, we shout out, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Va'ed. And that's because we're drowning out. The Kohen is giving us the blessing, but we don't want to hear. We're afraid to hear the actual name of God because some people might misuse it. So that's why we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Va'ed to make sure that nobody hears it. Okay. Okay, now we're up to the almost, I don't know if we're going to finish it, but we're 2 psukim away from finishing. If you make an altar of stones, you can't chisel them out. Because by putting your sword on it, you're defiling it. We don't want you to put your iron sword on the altar. What's the reasoning? Rashi tells us beautifully. Rabbi Shmuel Omer Kol im v'im shebetorah rishus chutz mishlosha. Whenever it says if in the Torah, it's optional, except for these 3 times. V'im is be'achavanim tazali. If you make an altar of stone, no, you have to. Harei im zeh meshamish b'lashon kasher means when. Because kasher tazali is be'achavanim. When you make this altar of stones, then do not build them from hewn stones. How did they get these stones if you couldn't chisel them out? How'd they get them? They had the shamir, they had the worm that was helped them to get it. Okay, we'll stop here to daven mincha. Big shkoyach to everybody. Anybody has any questions, happy to.